Hello again, everybody. We're coming towards the end of the book now, just 3 more chapters to read. Before we go on to chapter 10, let's just remind ourselves quickly of what happened last time. Ben has come down the corridor on a wave of water, followed by Mrs. Craven, the head teacher who'd obviously escaped from her room. And he's gone flying through the hatch onto Mrs. Brooks' desk. And now he's just about to find out what happens next. Let's read on. Chapter 10, No Time to Lose. Ben could hear voices. He guessed that Mr. McCann had reached the stepladder. Ben bent towards the hatch and strained his ears, taking care not to be seen in the corridor. "Mr. McCann," Mrs. Craven was saying in a shaky voice. She sounded angry but controlled. Ben had heard that voice before. "I want you to go straight up the corridor." Ben thought he heard Mr. McCann gasp. Or was it a sigh? Did Mrs. Craven realise that the corridor was still full of water? Mrs. Craven continued. "And tell Mrs. Peacock to leave the building immediately." There was a short pause. "And not to return. Her wages will be in the post. I will teach her class from now on." Now it was Ben's turn to gasp. Mrs. Peacock, his favourite teacher, going and not returning. She had only filled the classroom with water to keep them quiet. He couldn't blame her. And Mrs. Craven teaching his class. He had to act fast. Ben slid off the desk and crawled to the doorway. The coast was clear. Mr. McCann had tied the stepladder to a door handle with a piece of string. Mrs. Craven was still sitting miserably on her life raft, shivering and staring up the corridor at Mr. McCann's retreating back as he made his way, half wading, half swimming, to Mrs. Peacock's classroom. Ben knew that he had to reach the classroom before Mr. McCann did. There was only one way to do this. He would have to get there by going outside, climbing up the hosepipe, over the roof and down into the classroom. There was a door at the back of Mrs. Brooks's office. That door led outside. There was no time to lose. By the time Ben had scooted along the side of the building and heaved himself up onto the roof, he could hardly breathe. He was freezing and panting heavily. He leaned over the skylight and looked down into the classroom. Somebody had managed to push the door shut after Ben had been swept out, but a lot of water had escaped with him. He was surprised to see the children standing on the floor, the water up to their shoulders. They were gathered in front of Mrs. Peacock, who was looking thoughtful, as though she was trying to decide what to do next. Before she could do anything, Ben swung into action. "Who needs Superman underpants?" he said to himself as he grabbed the end of the hosepipe and jumped through the skylight. "I am Superman! Whee!" Ben shut his eyes and bent his knees. His body made a loud smacking sound as it hit the water, producing a huge spray which sent several children reeling backwards. Mrs. Peacock wobbled and opened her mouth wide in astonishment. But Ben Bailey," she stuttered. "What are you doing back here?" "I've come to rescue you," he said, looking straight back at Mrs. Peacock. All eyes were on Ben. "Right," he said quickly, turning to his classmates. "We need to get Mrs. Peacock up on top of the cupboard." Joe Rimmer burst out laughing. Mrs. Peacock opened her mouth wide again. "What?" she exclaimed. "Mrs. Peacock," said Ben earnestly, "please, just do it. You're in danger. Mrs. Craven wants to get rid of you." Mrs. Peacock's open mouth made a sort of squeaking noise. "Jake, on my shoulders," said Ben, grabbing his friend's arm. Jake did as he was told. Ben glanced around him, peering through Jake's legs. "Now you, Joe, on Jake's shoulders, then Megan, then—" He looked directly at Mrs. Peacock. "Mrs. Peacock, you need to climb up, all of us, and onto the cupboard." Mrs. Peacock nodded dumbly. She began to scramble up the human totem pole as hands reached out to push and pull her to the top. She balanced for a few seconds on Megan's shoulders before taking a deep breath and with one last burst of energy heaved herself up onto the cupboard. She slumped down onto a pile of books, sending them slithering across the top of the cupboard. Ben looked up proudly. It didn't really matter if she looked like a beached whale. It didn't matter that her hat had been dragged down over her eyebrows so that she could hardly see. It didn't even matter that her swirly pink and purple bottom was right now squashing Ben's model of a stegosaurus made out of cereal boxes and aerosol tops. All that mattered was that Mrs. Peacock was safe. "Now listen, everybody," Ben said importantly, and taking a deep breath, began to explain his plan. And that's the end of chapter 10. We'll have to wait till tomorrow night to see what happens next. I wonder what Ben's plan is going to be. Thanks for listening. See you again tomorrow.